Welcome to the APAPP podcast. I'm Corinne Young, your host today for the podcast on biologics in COPD patients. And joining me today is Dr. Jamie Rutland. Dr. Rutland completed his Bachelor's of Science from the University of California, Davis, Medical School and Internal Medicine residency from the University of Iowa Carver College of Medicine, and completed his fellowship in pulmonary and critical care from the University of Kansas Medical Center. Dr. Rutland is an expert in asthma, COPD, ILD, EPIS, navigational bronchoscopy, and breathing. He serves Orange County and Riverside, California at West Coast Lung. He also has a nonprofit, Illuminate Health, which provides educational content for underserved patients. He also has a for-profit, Medical Digital Opinion Leaders, which also produces awareness campaigns and materials for specific disease states. You may also know Dr. Rutland as the 2023 keynote speaker at CHEST in Hawaii, who did a great job there. Today, we've asked Dr. Rutland to come on and discuss the role of biologic therapy in COPD. And at the time of this recording, currently there are no approved biologics for COPD, but they should be getting approval in June 2024. So we wanted to get the jump on it and pick Dr. Rutland's brain on the who, when, and why of biologics in COPD. So thank you, Dr. Rutland, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. He's a busy guy, and we finally got him to commit to CNS, so we're very excited to have him. So let's briefly talk about the evolution of thinking of COPD as an eosinophilic and not a neutrophilic-driven disease. So I know I've been doing this almost 20 years, and back then, there was a pretty dogmatic approach about COPD is neutrophilic, asthma is eosinophilic. And then there were these discussions about asthma COPD overlap. And maybe just in those conditions, COPD could start behaving eosinophilic-like. And now so much more has come forward in phenotyping COPD. So could you help us kind of dive into that piece a little bit?
Whenever you do things like this, you really get to be honest, right? And I think that if there's anything that I am, is I'm a very honest person. And so the first thing we always have to start with is we have to define what chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is. So chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is really two conditions. You either have chronic bronchitis, which is inflammation and mucus production from the pipes that are carrying air to the lung, right? Or you have emphysema. Emphysema is just dead lung. I mean, I think that's the first order of business. In fact, in my clinic, I don't even allow my kids to say like COPD. They have to say the chronic bronchitis or emphysema. That's the first order of business. The second order of business is we spend a lot of time trying to split. Is it COPD? Is it asthma? Is it overlap? Who cares? The airway is the airway, right? And when you think about the airway, every breath that you take, you're constantly exposing your airway epithelial cells and your goblet cells to the environment. Every cigarette puff you take, every vape puff you take, it's just concentrated environment that you're exposing to your cells. And if you have that genetic predisposition to do so, your cells are going to be aggravated by that concentration of the environment. Even in areas of the country where you have heavy air pollution, you have inflammation that takes place. Now, what's happened over the course of the last 20 years, 30 years, is we have a greater understanding of immunology. We have a greater understanding of the way in which cells communicate and what types of cells end up in areas of the airway. When you think about COPD, people would normally say that most of the time, the types of cells that are infiltrating that airway are neutrophils. It is probably still that way. But as we've been able to identify different types of inflammation, and the ones that we can really characterize, type 1, type 2, type 3 inflammation, we can characterize that type of inflammation. We can define it. And there are certain levels in the blood and certain levels of molecules that we exhale that can really tell us that there's a significant presence of type 2 inflammation. And that's kind of what's changed in terms of, COPD management. Again, these patients were managed with local inhalers, but this has transitioned over time to start to think about using cellular communication inhibitors, or biologics as they're called, to knock down some of these inflammatory mediators so that people can feel better. It's kind of a long-winded introduction, but that's the way I like people to start thinking about it. Like, right, the airway is the airway.
I love that. I work with a lot of docs that will say exactly what you said. Who cares? They're sister diseases, they're airway diseases, and we treat the airway, and that's what we should focus on. So I'm glad to hear that echoed, in your station as well. So when should we be thinking that this patient is a type 2 driven patient? You mentioned type 1, type 2, type 3. So maybe just break down for those that may not be as familiar, type 2 inflammation. And again, seeing that patient and thinking, you know what, I think you might be a type 2 COPD patient.
Yeah. Um, Again, airway epithelial cells, when they're aggravated, we're going to secrete certain molecules that we call alarmins or cytokines. They're just making phone calls. They're just secreting these molecules, right? And the molecules we're talking about, they have names: interleukin 25, interleukin 33, TSLP. They're going to communicate with other cells. And this communication that takes place can lead to kind of a polarity or kind of a specific type of cell that gets produced. So when we say type 2, the specific types of cells that sort of drive this inflammatory process are the Th2 cell, which is a T cell, a helper T cell. And then you also have the innate lymphoid cell type 2. That's why it's called type 2 inflammatory cell. And what these cells do is they produce what we call type 2 inflammatory cytokines: interleukin 4, interleukin 5, interleukin 9, interleukin 13. And under the influence of those cytokines, you get certain things happening within your bloodstream. You get certain cells recruited into your airway. So when you look at interleukin 4's responsibility is to bind to its receptor, which is on a bunch of different white blood cells. But specifically, when it binds to a plasma cell, it's going to tell this plasma cell to make more IgE and IgG1 antibodies. There's 5 types of antibodies floating around in your bloodstream. There's IgA, there's IgM, there's IgG, there's IgD, and there's IgE. IgA has really 2 subgroups. There's IgA1 and IgA2. IgG has like 4 subgroups: 1, 2, 3, and 4. But these antibodies have a responsibility in your body. IgE, the antibody that I was just talking about, that gets upregulated with the influence that we're looking for, binds to some of the allergic cells in your body: the mast cell, the basophil, the eosinophil, causing release of granules, which are in these cells, which are just full of more cytokines and chemokines. And what these cytokines and chemokines do, like eotaxin 1, 2, and 3, periostin, TRC, is they actually lead to expression of receptors on your lymph tissue, on your blood vessels, so that eosinophils bind to those receptors and then they roll into the area where they're being recruited. So they'll roll into your airway. That's type 2 inflammation. Interleukin 5 is responsible for eosinophil maturity, allows the eosinophil to grow up. It's like the mom, right? Interleukin 9 is responsible for mast cell maturity. Mast cells are cells, they're cousins of eosinophils. They release a lot of inflammatory mediators when IgE binds to them. And then you also have interleukin 13. Interleukin 13 has a heavy responsibility, but here's the thing about interleukin 13 is interleukin 13 has its optimal activity under the influence of interleukin 4. So interleukin 4's receptor and interleukin 13's receptor sort of dimerize together, and you get the downstream events. What are those events? So you stimulate the goblet cell to make more mucus, and more specifically, that goblet cell, which makes mucus, is making more MUC5A, which is a really dense, thicker mucus that likes to tether to the goblet cell. So it's like a little bit harder to get rid of when you compare it to like MUC5B. It also stimulates what's called macrophage polarization. So macrophages, which are white blood cells that kind of set the environment, they normally recruit inflammatory types of cells. They might release molecules that recruit neutrophils over, or other monocytes like dendritic cells over. But under the influence of interleukin 13, the macrophage makes an environment that recruits over fibroblasts and myofibroblasts, which kind of lay down collagen. So these are type 2 inflammatory things that are happening. And the way that we check it out in our bloodstream is we'll get an eosinophil count. So if your eosinophil count's high, you have type 2 inflammation. We might have somebody breathe out into a machine called pheno, which can be tough sometimes. People are really obstructed. And sometimes it can be off when people are doing certain things. But if your pheno is above 20 parts per billion, we'll say that's type 2 inflammation. And then the other thing we'll check is an IgE. The easiest thing to do is to check the eosinophil count. And when you look at the studies for COPD, biologics and COPD, that's what people are doing, is they're getting a CBC with this and they're saying, if your eosinophil count is 300, we're saying you have type 2 inflammation. These are the patients that we want to give biologics to, right? And I don't think that they're wrong. I mean, that's the way that I would have done it too. And my mother-in-law is on a biologic at this time, right? But again, like, and she's, just really, really ill and has extremely reactive airway disease. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help people. So we look for people that have high eosinophil counts and COPD.
Would you look at a patient, let's say you don't have historical data on them and you're waiting for, those biomarkers to come back. Maybe you don't have pheno in your office. Is there anything that would trigger you to think that this could be a type 2 patient or a patient that I should look at their biomarkers?
Yeah, I mean, if they exacerbate a lot, so anybody that has moderate to severe COPD, right? Moderate, defined by the gold strategy. But if they exacerbate a lot, if they produce a lot of mucus, like these are individuals that probably have an element of type 2 inflammation. I mean, we say about 20% of the patients that have COPD have type 2 inflammation.
So now let's dig in a little bit to the trials. I was involved in the Terra Nova trial, which was the BINRA, the first study that was done in COPD patients looking at biologic therapy. And it failed. It failed miserably. And I think some of the argument is that study design was a big part of that failure. But same type of inclusion criterias that we're seeing in the other COPD biologic studies. MEPO has a study currently, which is the matinee study or manatee. I think actually it's manatee. And dupilumab is the one that's likely going to get approved first, looking at COPD patients with eosinophils that are high. And that trial is the Boreas trial. So since they're likely to be first to market, I was wondering if you can kind of give us the cliff notes on Boreas.
I mean, the clip notes are pretty simple. So the clip notes is they looked at people who had moderate or severe COPD who were exacerbators. These are individuals that had a history of exacerbation, individuals that had moderate and severe COPD, and individuals that had an eosinophil count that was 300 and above. And they had their triple therapy. So they were on an ICS, a LABA, and a LAMA. They could be on dual therapy if an inhaled corticosteroid was contraindicated, right? For whatever the reason was. These are the people that were enrolled in the trial, and these people received dupilumab every couple of weeks. And they compared them to people who didn't receive it. And what they saw, and again, we have Boreas, but we also have Notice, which was just released. What we saw was about a 30% reduction in exacerbations over a 52-week period. Oh, yeah. Yeah, no. Well, secondary endpoints also were lung function. So the lung function, people were able to breathe out a little bit more air, whatever that means, right? Whatever that means. Again, who knows what is significant? We have come up with these numbers that we think are clinically significant. We'll say, well, 12% or 200 cc's, that's significant. Well, I mean, those numbers are kind of pulled out of the sky. They didn't really come from anywhere. So again, you know that you're affecting the airway because you're breathing out more air. You can see that.
Mhm. So another thing I thought was interesting in that study is most COPD exacerbation reduction studies. Now, these were generally like inhaler studies. They wouldn't allow active smokers in the studies, but Boreas did. And those are our patients we know chronically exacerbate. They're definitely fueled to exacerbate. But also, I thought it was interesting that we know smoking can also elevate your eosinophils. So I don't know if you have any take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the take is that's real world, right? Right.
Hmm.
People smoke.
Hmm.
So, I mean, we control all these populations so much in our studies, and it doesn't really reflect what happens outside right now, right? And so I think it's important. Like, I don't have to extrapolate anything. I know that, oh, they allowed smokers and this product worked. My patients still smoke. Some of my patients still smoke. They have moderate, severe COPD, and they still smoke. Right. So yeah, smoking is going to stimulate that airway epithelial cell. Smoking is going to, because again, what's in a cigarette, right? These are molecules that your body doesn't like, and you might develop an allergy to them. And the eosinophil is the cell that's responsible for dealing with these kinds of things.
Mhm.
So for me, it's kind of like, for me, it's just, it's pretty simple. Like, this is real world type of stuff. So
Mhm.
I have no problem with it.
I know in a lot of the asthma biologic studies, I think a lot of them excluded smokers. And so then I think we were kind of left with treating our asthma patients with biologics who were smoking and exacerbating. Do we treat them or not? Because they're smoking and we didn't really know, is it really going to impact them? But, I think we might be able to glean, maybe some of that data from the COPD years. But next question I wanted to ask you was about gold. So gold updates, in 23 kind of primed us to look for biomarkers. I think maybe anticipating this was coming. So now there's a place for looking at eosinophils in these patients. Do you anticipate seeing biologics added to that tiered approach to reduce exacerbations in COPD patients?
Probably. I mean, they'll probably update it and include it. Um, I think it depends on a lot, right? Because you're talking about medication that is not cheap, in a population of patients that um, may be on a lot of other medicines. So that's where when you put things in strategies, right? I know everybody likes to say gold guideline, but the gold is just a strategy. When you put things in strategies, then people kind of take it like the Bible. So you just have to be able to handle all of that, from a cost perspective. I mean, I think that's important. Um, yeah, but I do see them, just like the Gina strategy did. I do see them including cellular communication inhibitors in the future, because when you think about molecules, most molecules act cellularly and calm down the inflammatory response. When you think about inhaled corticosteroids, what are they doing? Right, they're reducing the amount of transcription of pro-inflammatory cytokines. That's how inhaled corticosteroids work. Long-acting beta agonists are bronchodilating. Long-acting muscarinic antagonists are dilating the airway as well. But there's one other thing that they're doing that people don't often think of. White blood cells have muscarinic receptors. So long-acting muscarinic antagonists are also inhibiting some of the activation of white blood cells. So when we start to think cellularly and cell-to-cell communication, you're going to start to see the evolution and advancement of some of these strategies that need these updates, and I think that's important.
Do you think that we're going to see as much benefit with the anti-IL-5s as we are with what we're seeing so far with the Dupy data?
It's hard. It's hard to say because you've had essentially one and a half, I would say, failed trials with the IL-5s, right? You're trying so hard to have an impact, and they haven't gotten there yet. This is not to say that it's not important to inhibit interleukin 5 in this population of patients and it would lead to some clinical improvement. This is just to show you how redundant the body can be in terms of creating an inflammatory process. And one of the things I've always loved about dupilumab is that you're inhibiting two different cytokines, right? And when you inhibit those two different cytokines, you're acting on multiple pathways. And as much as we try to make all biologics the same and put them all in the same category, this is different than the other one. You're inhibiting more than one molecule. I don't think that should be just glossed over, right? I don't think that should be ignored. So it didn't surprise me that, dupilumab's data was, as strong as it could be in this population of patients, right? This population of patients are really sick.
They are very sick. Want to pick your brain a little bit about asthma COPD overlap. So which I know is kind of controversial because it's all an airway. I get that piece. But, historically, trials have excluded anybody with a history of asthma from COPD trials and anybody with obstructive airway of any kind from the asthma trials. And so, now that you have these patients in your office, do you think it would change your perspective of treatment for these patients of maybe going to a biologic sooner or, because again, the kind of consortium opinion on asthma COPD overlap is treat the most prominent disease, right? If it's behaving more like an asthmatic patient, treat them like asthma. As far as like inhaled therapy, starting more with ICS than starting with LAMA type thing. So, do you think that's going to influence you at all on how you treat your patients if they're behaving one way or the other and you can't really tear them apart?
I mean, it's not like it influences me because there's things I already do, right? And so it's kind of like you just said. Um, if you really sit and think about it, and you think about the airway in general, or you think about asthma or COPD, which disease has more options for therapy? So, like, why wouldn't you say, okay, if my patient has an overlap, I'm going to treat them like an asthmatic because I have way more options for therapy that I can try, right? And so, like, if you look at my mother-in-law, that's what we did, right? And so, like, I have no problem with it if it helps patients and it keeps them out of the hospital. We can't lose sight of that.
Right.
And I think a lot of physicians lose sight of that is they split so much that they don't help anyone. And that becomes that's a real issue for me sometimes. Like when people are like, oh, well, there's no data to support what you're doing. Well, there's no data to support that giving Tylenol to a fever does anything, but you guys do it every single day when you're in the ICU, right? Or when you're in the hospital. So, it's kind of like people pick and choose and they have these moving targets for when they want to do something. And I think really it's a reflection of just being uncomfortable and maybe not quite understanding that immunology as well as we all should. I don't know, but I'm in the business of helping people. And so if a patient comes to me and they're sick and they're exacerbating, I'm going to look for ways to help them.
I think that's an excellent answer. Well, thank you so much for joining us today with that level of information. That is great. I really appreciate you. And we will be listing some links for Dr. Rutland below that you can check out if you want to see more of his content. Also, checking out his for profit and nonprofit organizations as well. Dr. Rutland, thank you again for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. And I will see you guys, I believe, in June.
Yes, at our
In
Vegas
Vegas.
conference. Yeah, thank you. All right, see you
Yep.
then.
Take care.